science at UNCG and San Francisco State before that, and Wayne State University before that. You're not able to hear me?
Hold it closer.
Closer? I'll just pull it out and hold it. Okay. Is that better? Great, thank you. Yeah, I hate it when someone speaks and I can't hear them. So. In fact, I had to run home a few minutes ago. I forgot to put my hearing aids in. Anyway, and my area of specialization was in sport history. And I taught the sort of humanities within departments of exercise and sports science and the role of sport in the United States primarily, but also in the world. And the history of the Olympic Games, particularly the modern games, has always been a kind of a love of mine. In fact, I spent more than a couple of days, I guess, up at Princeton University a number of years ago, going through their alumni archives and tracing the history of the background of the four young men from Princeton who were a part of this first Olympic team. But at any rate, as a sport historian, I'll try to give you a little bit of background on the first Olympic Games and the boys that made up that team, and they were all boys. There were no women on the first Olympics. And let's see if I can operate this correctly here. Okay. First of all, the early attempts to revive the games were built because we had been without the Olympic Games for about 1,500 years or so. The ancient games ran from 776 BC to about 393 BC when they were banned by the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius the First. He felt that it wasn't appropriate. These were ancient Greek games in the pre-Christian days, and he was a Christian, and he didn't feel that was right to be a part of the Roman an activity going on in the Roman Empire, despite all the other awful things that went on during those decades and centuries. There were some efforts to revive the games that began, first of all, in the 18th and 19th centuries. The German archaeologists have become very, very interested in ancient societies, particularly in Greek and Roman societies. And so they had begun a lot of digs over that 200 or so year period, and bringing artifacts back, of course, to German universities and museums and so on. The German and Swedish gymnastics became very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. Swedish gymnastics, in fact, became very popular and were used as early physical education programs here in the United States, particularly in what we would call the Ivy League schools now, Harvard and Yale, and down at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, but a number of the schools, but particularly in New England. German gymnastics were made popular first, of course, in Germany. Johann Friedrich Jahn back in the very early 19th century, and in they were brought to the United States by German immigrants in the mid-19th century. Became very big wherever Germans settled. There were Turnvereins, they were called, Turner societies that helped the German immigrants become acclimated to the United States. That they taught citizenship classes and so on. But a center of it were their gymnastics. They always had gymnasiums where these could be practiced. Very big in Cincinnati, Louisville, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, all the places where we had early breweries, that's where the Germans were. They also had German gymnastics. In fact, the state of North Dakota was and they weren't made a state until, 1889, both the Dakotas and Wyoming and Montana in 1889. And they were the first ones to require physical education in their public schools. It was written into their constitution and they were German gymnastics. So there were these kinds of things going on as well in Europe and in the United States. The British were the first to really begin to organize sport, particularly what we would think of today as the Olympic sports, and leading the way with track and field athletics and swimming, and of course their team sports of rugby and soccer or football as they referred. So there's a lot of interest going on in sports during these years. There were various efforts during the 19th century to try and revive the Olympic Games. The Swedes tried it at one point, the Germans did it at another point, even the Brits got in on it, but none of these really lasted. And then we come to Baron Pierre de Coubertin, from a noble family in France. Lived from 1863, born in Paris, died September 2nd, 1937, in Switzerland, where he had moved. He was a French gentleman of noble ancestry. The family had kind of lost a lot of their prestige, meaning they'd also lost a lot of their money over a number of years, but he was still a very well-respected person. And he became a historian, a journalist, a social critic, and a proselytizer of international sport. The defeat of the French army by Prussia and the loss of the Alsace-Lorraine area, which had been fought over for centuries between the two groups of people, it greatly affected him as a child and as an adolescent. He was just embarrassed by that, embarrassed to be a Frenchman, wanted to do something that would help the French become stronger by emphasizing athletics. He really admired, he was an Anglophile. He loved the British, unusual for a Frenchman, but especially at that time. But he loved the British. He liked the idea of manhood and empire, and credited a lot of it to the English love of sport and exercise, which were particularly promulgated in the public schools. We would think of as private schools, Eton and so on in England, where those games were very much an important part of building young gentlemen who would go on to be leaders in the nation and in the empire. He eventually came to view the idea of sport as a means to friendly competition and world peace. Well, we know what happened with that. But nevertheless, it was an ideal that he had. And he worked incessantly, I guess would be the word, through that latter part of the 19th century to convince other leaders and other nations that reviving the Olympic Games would be a really, really good thing. The idea they'd be held every 4 years, as they had been roughly in ancient times. He cultivated allies in the United States and in England, particularly, along with other European nations throughout the 1880s and 1890s. And he's still this very, very young man in his 20s and early 30s. Had the money to be able to travel to these places, including 2 or 3 trips to the United States to talk with people who were running the fairly new AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, which controlled a good deal of amateur sport in this country. About this this idea of starting the Olympic Games. In 1892, he hosted in Paris an international congress on physical education and sport. And there he was able to bring together many of these people that he had talked to in these other countries, and they were kind of sold on the idea, but there was still some pessimism there as well. But 2 years later, in 1894, I got to click on that or not? Yeah, okay. The second Congress was held, and at that one, they approved the idea of holding the Olympic Games in 1896 in Athens, because it seemed appropriate to revive the games in the nation that had first developed them some 2,500, 3,000 years earlier. And then created from that what we know today as the International Olympic Committee, and these were primarily men. They were primarily men, either of some wealth or of, I guess, knowledge and interest in this idea. And that brings us to Dr. William Milligan Sloan, who was a Princeton University professor of French and Latin and European history, who was at Princeton from 1876 to 1896, the year that the games began. He had convinced him that this was great, and he would be instrumental in at least getting the small Princeton contingent of 4 young men to participate in these games. He then went to Columbia University as a professor of European history from 1896 until his death in 1928. And he had become a good friend of Pierre de Coubertin and a promoter of the Olympic dream here in this country. He was a founding member of that International Olympic Committee and chair of the American Olympic Committee, today called the United States Olympic Committee, the USOC. And undoubtedly, he ran interference with the Princeton administration that allowed the 4 boys in the middle of the spring semester to leave for a month or so to sail across the sea to Athens. He was a very important person as far as the United States was concerned. Okay, let's look at those first modern games. They were held from April 16th to the 15th of 1896. There were 280 competitors. Do you know how many competitors there are in today's Olympics that are going on in France right now? 10,500.
Wow.
There were 12 to 14 nations. Some of them had agreed to come and then maybe got there and then didn't. The athletes didn't actually compete for injuries or whatever reason. Today there are, let's see, the number of nations. I think I got that. Yeah, 206 nations today, by the way. The number of sports, there were 9 sports holding 43 different events within those sports. Athletics, which we call track and field in this country, and the rest of the world refers to them athletics. Cycling, fencing, gymnastics, shooting, swimming, weightlifting, tennis, and wrestling. From the ancient games, wrestling and athletics, possibly later on weightlifting, maybe some of those from the original games. We didn't have cycling back in the ancient world. Yes.
Sports are there? How many different sports are there today?
Today?
Yes.
I just happen to have it. There are today the number of 300. There are, let's see, there's 329 events. I have forgotten the exact number of sports for some reason. And I should have done that, and I completely forgot. But there are 329 different events. And they've added so many in the last 20 years or so. So today we even have breakdancing going on. And surfing, way over in Tahiti, because it was a French colony. But adding a lot of those more modern sports to attract more young people. They felt that young people were not watching on television enough, and so they decided to do some of this. The medals that were awarded at the first games and at the second ones in Paris in 1900, first place was silver, not gold. And the winner also received an olive branch, as in the olden days, and a diploma. Second place was a copper medal, which would be bronze, and the laurel branch and a diploma. It would be in 1904, at the third Olympic Games that were held in St. Louis, Missouri, that they went to gold, silver, and bronze. And now they recognized third place, but they didn't get a medal for that. They really were just recognizing the first two in these games. This is the stadium that was held. It was built in 330 BC. So this is not exactly a new foundation here. It had been excavated, but was in total disrepair, as you can imagine, after they dug all the eons of dirt and clay away from it. And the Greek government then, as so often, was in somewhat disarray and did not have the money to be able to reconstruct the stadium. And George Aroff, who was a wealthy Egyptian Greek, made his money in the shipping industry. He gave direction to it and financial aid to be able to do that. You'll notice how that track is so elongated, long straightaways, and very short, by today's standards, turns. And you can imagine how hard that was for sprinters making some of those turns.
It's just a horseshoe.
I'm sorry?
They couldn't run in a do multiple laps. It looks like.
No, it does go all the way around. You can't. I think it goes right behind the building there. Yeah. Right. But anyway, the runners were forced to kind of slow at the curves in order to stay in their lanes. Any of you that ran track in high school or college or ran on indoor tracks, you know how difficult that was, Stephen. Your experience did that. I was a distance runner, so it was a little easier for me. Okay, America's first Olympic team. There was a real failure to attract top athletes from the U.S. and England. The major organizations, the British equivalent to our AAU, were just not interested. They didn't think this was going to fly. There had been other attempts to do this, and they just didn't think it was going to really happen. So there was no national push for athletes. The press largely ignored it. Well, the New York Times covered the preceding the games. They advertised it a little bit, and the New York Herald did as well. But most of the press in the country, people didn't even know this was going on. In fact, Harvard University, one of the strongest track teams in athletic teams, did you ever know that the original football factories were Harvard and Yale? They were the Alabamas and the Ohio States of today in the late 19th century. But for the most part, the names were kind of ignored. Harvard did not send any of their athletes. A few of their, 2 or 3 of their alums went, but none of their current. Oh, one current player did, but he got permission to go. The Americans had 13, and it's called volunteers, mostly in track and field, as we'll see, that they were willing to compete and largely at their own expense or that of their club. 4 young men from from Princeton, went because Robert Garrett, the captain of their team, they were all 4 of them were juniors, by the way. We'll meet them here in a few minutes. But Robert Garrett came from a very wealthy banking family in Baltimore, and he talked 3 of his teammates into going with him on this adventure, and they were real hesitant to do it. He said, "I'll pay your way," and they certainly were much more excited about going. So they did. Oh, and the Boston group, the Boston Athletic Association, did fund to a certain degree their athletes. Some of them paid their own way, because many of them were wealthy anyway. They had gone to Ivy schools. They had not many middle class or lower class folks went to college back in those days. Getting to Athens, the trip was really interesting. They were on a tramp steamer, the Fulda. It was either a German or a Norwegian ship. I tried to find out more about that particular ship, but there were a lot of ships called the Fulda. I think it was all from one company that ran. But these tramp steamers were boats that or ships that moved from one port to another and would pick up goods to be transported wherever they could get the biggest load, and then they would take off. It wasn't a regular schedule. But anyway, they got the whole team, both from Boston and from Princeton, went aboard that ship and left in 18 on March 21st of 1896, April of 1896. Oh, no, I said March, I'm sorry. I'm looking at a couple of different sets of notes here. The prospects for success for them were not great. No one really expected it, because there was one national champion, one of the boys from Harvard, was national AAU champion in the 800 meters, but they weren't running the 800 there. But other than that, these were just average runners, particularly the Princeton boys. None of them were great athletes, but they were on the Princeton track team. So the prospects of success were really kind of abysmal. And they declined from there. It was kind of a star-crossed trip. They began their odyssey, as I said, on March 21st. It was to go from New York City to Naples, Italy, and then they would get other transportation from there. The ship was really ill-equipped to handle passengers, but they could handle the 13 and then maybe the 2 or 3 coaches and trainers from the Boston Athletic Association that went along. And it was a rough trip. It was a 12-day trip. They had a little room to exercise. The athletes were reckoning on the benefits of 2 weeks worth of workouts in Athens prior to the start of the Olympics. But when they got there, they found out that Greece was still operating on the Julian, not the Gregorian calendar. And instead of April 18th, which they had thought the games were starting, it was April 6th, the day after they arrived. So, that was another part of this whole star-crossed trip. Francis Lane, one of the sprinters from Princeton, was seasick practically the entire trip. Tom Curtis, who eventually won the high hurdles at the 120 hurdles, banged his head trying to practice, banged his head on an iron pipe, and had to have stitches taken. But they said that within a half an hour he was his old self again, so it couldn't have been too terribly bad. When they crossed Italy by train, the team then sailed to Patras, a Greek port in the Ionian Sea, and the weary Americans disembarked and immediately boarded a train for a 10-hour trip then to Athens. They arrived on April 5th, utterly dispirited, for the descriptions written by some of the some of the team members. When they got there, they were greeted by some Greek Athens dignitaries, who then gave them a couple of speeches, and then marched them. They don't say exactly how far, but one description was at least a mile, marched them to their hotel, where they are again greeted, and had to listen to 2 or 3 more speeches that were all in Greek, and they couldn't understand a word that was being said. So they were, let's say that when they finally got to their beds, they were ready to sleep. Okay, who were these athletes, and where did they come from? Well, I want to start with the Princeton foursome first. They're closest to my heart anyway, because they're the ones I've studied the most over the years. Francis Lane, a sprinter, Herbert Jameson, 400 meters, and Robert Garrett, the person who paid for the boy from Baltimore, who paved the way for his teammates, who won the shot put and the discus on the very first day, that next day of competition, and then finished second in the long jump and high in the third in the high jump, and Albert Tyler, pole vaulter, who finished second. Lane won his qualifying heat in 100 meters, but he tied for third in the finals, but of course didn't get a medal because they weren't giving out medals for third place back then. But Robert Garrett is the one that has really an interesting story. He and one of the guys from the Boston contingent. He was 20 years old. He was captain of the Princeton team, as I said, and he heard about it from William Milligan Sloan, the history professor, that had talked to him and some of the other boys about making this trip. And they wore their Princeton uniforms. They had orange and black. That's what they wore at the games. The story of him with the discus, though, is the interesting one. The discus was not being contested in the United States at that time, and he had not seen one. So he went back and looked in some ancient writings and found what he thought were the correct dimensions for a discus. And he went to a local blacksmith and had him make one out of steel with the dimensions that he had been able to find, and it was about 20 pounds. And so he was practicing with this discus, and it just did not was not working. And he said, I can't do this. So he kind of gave up on it. He left his iron discus back in Princeton, and thought, well, I'll just compete in the shot put in the high and long jumps. When he got over to Greece, and he was walking to the stadium that next morning, the day of the competition, and he found a discus. By the stadium, he found a discus laying on the ground, and so he picked it up and said, "Gosh, the discus is supposed to be 5 pounds, not 20 pounds." And so he tried throwing it a little bit, and so he got inside the stadium, and one of the Greeks helped him with his form and everything. And the Greeks were very confident in this, by the way. They had what they felt were really strong discus throwers and shot puts. After all, these were their games. They'd invented them way back there, all those years and centuries before. Anyway, he winds up winning the discus that day, and he beat the Greek champion by 7 inches, 7.5 inches, I believe. There he is here, and then beat their shot put champion as well a little bit later. The distances would not be would not get you anywhere in a high school meet today. I think the current Olympic record is 229 feet 3 inches, and he threw 95 feet 7.5 inches. That was by meters, but they converted it. the shot put was 36 feet, 9 3/4 inches he threw, and today it's over 70 feet. If you remember way back in the 50s when 60 feet was the goal for everyone. Okay, so that's Garrett, really interesting person. Went on to serve on the, Steve?
Did everyone have to provide all of their own equipment?
That's my understanding, yes. Yeah, that you brought your own equipment with you, yes.
And so,
Including a pole vault.
I was gonna ask about that.
Yeah. And that's done today, of course. Yeah, I remember helping pole vaulters carry poles through airports when I was coaching. So. Herbert Jameson from Peoria, Illinois, was a 400-meter runner, and he took second in the 400 meters. Did not continue competing after he graduated the following year. All these guys graduated in the class of '97, a year later. But he went back to Peoria. His father either owned, it's a little discrepant, whether he owned it or he was the head of a farm implement company in Peoria. And he worked for his father for a number of years, and then went into the insurance business, became a very successful insurance salesman after that.
Dave,
Yes.
I'm from Peoria, or we lived in Peoria, and there's a school named after him.
Oh, is there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right, fine. The Jameson School.
Yeah.
Okay, it's an elementary or high school?
I think it's a middle school.
Oh, really? Okay. Interesting. Albert Tyler from Glendale, Ohio. And I believe, yeah, he was a cousin of Jameson, but they both went to Princeton at the same time. He was a pole vaulter, and he finished second. In fact, the two American pole vaulters, one of them was from Boston, and who won it, and Jameson didn't start jumping until 10 feet. The world record today is over 20 feet, but it was 10 feet. The winner was, I believe, 10 feet 8 inches, if I'm not mistaken. Albert Tyler went on to be an educator. I think I'm right on that. Yes, he became a math teacher and a football official in Philadelphia. He played on the football and baseball teams as well at Princeton. Pretty good athlete. Died of pneumonia in 1945 at the age of 73 while vacationing at his place in his vacation home in Maine. Francis, or Frank Lane, as he was known, was a sprinter, and as I said earlier, he was the one that was seasick all the way over on the Fulda, and tied for third in the 100 meters. Frank went on to Washington University after he graduated to medical school, and became ultimately an ophthalmologist in Chicago, and was the head of ophthalmology at Rush Medical School and Hospital in Chicago. Now the Boston Athletic Club contingent. I'm gonna skip down first of all to James B. Connolly. James is another one who has an interesting story. He was a high school dropout. He was one of 11 children in Boston. He was a high school dropout. Was not of that wealthy means that so many of the others were, and but became self-taught. Over a number of years, at the age of 27, became a freshman student at Harvard. So he was in his freshman year, it was the spring. He was struggling academically, but he was making it, but he didn't have real strong grades, and he went to the dean and said, I I'd like to have permission to take a leave of absence for a month and go to Greece and compete in the Olympic Games. And the dean turned him down flat. Well, Conway was he was a rough and tumble young guy, and he said, "All right, I'm through with Harvard. I quit. So I'm going to the Olympics." And I don't know if he said "see you later" or the equivalent of that in 1890s language or not, but he never. They tried to give him a number of years later when he became a very successful writer. They tried to give him an honorary degree, and he wouldn't accept it. He didn't. He wanted nothing to do with Harvard. He was still holding a grudge after all those years. But he did. He became a very well-regarded war correspondent for Collier's magazine during World War I, and then wrote a number of books over the years that primarily novels aimed at young boys and young men, adventure novels and so on. A little bit more about him. Born in 1868 and died in 57. In fact, he turned out to be the oldest of all of the longest lived of all of the team at 88. Robert Garrett was 86, I believe, when he passed away. But he won the triple jump again on that first day, and they had switched it. The Greeks were making it, instead of a hop, step, and jump, which is what it used to be, you run down the runway like you would in the long jump. You take a hop, and then a big step, and then finally a jump. And that's what he had prepared for. Maybe I'd have a hop, hop, and jump. So he had to learn that, and won it, I believe, on his third try. Finished second in the high jump and third in the long jump. He traded places in the long jump with Robert Garrett, the Princeton captain. Arthur Blake was a 1,500 meter runner and had a really exciting race there. A man by the name of Flack, I believe Robert Flack from Australia, won, but only by a second or two. And but he was a Harvard University graduate, and he was one of the people behind the Boston Athletic Association's initial idea to send a team to Athens. He also entered the marathon, but made it about 23 miles and had to drop out. But he was one of the true nationally recognized athletes, track and field athletes at that time. He won the 800 meters in the National AAU meet in 95, 96, 97, and 98, and ran a 48.8 in the 440 yards as well. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. I got you mixed up with another one. No, but it was Edward Flack from Australia, and then he became an insurance salesman as well. His after college career. Thomas Burke is the one who also won the 100 meters and was the national champion in the AAU. He finished first in the 100 meters and in the 400 meters. I didn't have an individual photo of him, but he's the second person there from the left in the picture. He's standing with the white outfit at the elbow. Ellery Clark from West Roxbury, Massachusetts. High jump, he finished first, and the long jump first. Clark, because of his very high grades, was given a leave of absence from Harvard. I I'm assuming by the same dean. I'm not sure, but he was a much better student, and he wasn't a freshman. He was older at that point. By the way, in Olympic history, he's the only one to win both of those events, the high jump and the long jump, and no one else has ever done that. He also competed in the all-around competition. That would be the predecessor to today's decathlon, which is a 10-event event. Let's see. He went on to be a lawyer and author of 19 books and a civil servant. Served on the Boston School Board and as a city alderman. So he was a real civic-minded person. Tom Curtis, who is originally from California, born in San Francisco, but lived his life back east in the Boston area. He was an MIT. Did I say Harvard? I meant MIT. He was an MIT electrical engineering student at the time, so he too had taken a leave. And then he worked as an electrical contractor pretty much the rest of his life. He served as the captain of the Massachusetts National Guard, military aide to Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge during World War I. Bill Hoyt, William Hoyt from the Boston Athletic Association, born in 1875 in Connecticut, died in 1954 at age 79, an alumnus of Harvard, and an MD degree as well. Hoyt, he went on to his undergraduate medical school degrees from Harvard. He served in France during World War I, and then returned to Paris again later as a surgeon in the U.S. Public Health Service, and served out his career primarily in the Public Health Service. Now, we have the Payne brothers. John Payne had been in the military and was an expert at shooting, and there were two military pistol events, 25 meters and 30 meters. He took first in the military in the 25 meter, and decided not to compete in the 30 because his brother was competing with it too, and he wanted his brother to be able to win one. And he said, I didn't want to show up the Greeks. We didn't want to show up the Greeks too badly, as though they were showing off. So this is him. This is his older brother Sumner, who won the 30-meter free pistol first, and then stayed on in the 25-meter and finished second there. He was the older of the two brothers. He began his college career at Harvard, and then headed west and enrolled at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. He graduated, but he never became a doctor. And wound up living in Paris, and the most accurate information I found on him is that he was running an art gallery in Paris, and his brother on the way over left the rest of the group and went to Paris and talked his brother into coming with him. And said, come on, you compete in the Olympic Games. And so he became another member. So that's sometimes why it's 13 or 14 people that were on the team. But he did well, and died at age 35 of pneumonia. He was one of the two that died fairly young, either pneumonia or one of the other diseases rampant at that time. Gardner Williams competed for the Boston Athletic Association. He was a swimmer. However, Gardner comes across as somewhat of a dilettante in the world of sport. I'm not sure, but anyway, he was the only one of the only American among the 13 swimmers who competed at Athens. But it didn't last long. He entered the 100 and the 1200 meter freestyle races, but didn't medal at all. And the reason he didn't medal was not held in a pool. It was held in the chilly waters of the Bay of Zia. The temperature was reportedly in the mid-50s. They were taken out by boat to a wooden raft and jumped in the water and swam to shore. That was the race. He jumped in, came up, and said, "I'm freezing," and climbed back on the raft, and they took it back in the boat. So that was the extent of Port Gardner's Olympic competitive experience. And this is Charles Waldstein. A little bit different. A graduate of Columbia University. He was 40 years old. He was the oldest member of the American contingent. But he played a prominent role in the formation of the Olympic Games. Baron de Coubertin had asked him to help with the Olympics to win the favor of the Greek royal family. Evidently, he had ties somehow to the Greek royal family. He went ahead and participated in the 200 military rifle shooting event, but they don't have a record of where he finished. It was somewhere way down, somewhere in the middle of the pack. But he also helped organize the track and field and gymnastics events and refereed tennis and cycling events. So he was kind of a jack of all trades at the Olympics, but he's included as a part of this. So that's why I said there are 14, although we normally just recognize 13. We don't usually pay much attention to Waldstein. We do count Gardner Williams, even though he dropped out right away. One of the other things about James Connolly, the boy from Boston that said, "I'm through with Harvard," and was the oldest of all of them, was that he didn't compete with the Boston Athletic Association. He went with his smaller club, the Suffolk, which was still in Boston, but the Suffolk Athletic Club. So he wasn't part of he was part of the Boston contingent, but not of the Boston Athletic Association. And this is, as I had on the cover as well, but this is a photo of all the individual photos of all of the teams. It's kind of hard, you can't read underneath there, but I just read you all of their names. And these people on the side were from the Boston. John Graham, a BAA manager, translate that to coach, and Scotty McMaster, Princeton trainer, and then Boston Athletic Association trainer at the bottom, Tom Berry, that went along to take care of the boys. One of the other things that I didn't mention earlier either was that during the games, by chance, there was a United States naval ship that was docked near the games, and they came to the games every day and cheered on the American athletes. And there were a couple of other wealthy Americans vacationing in the area that feeded them to banquets at different times during their stay at the games. This is the first ever photo of an Olympic event, the 100-meter dash, and one of the I believe it was one of the Princeton boys was a photographer, amateur photographer, and he took a number of pictures of non-competitive parts of the game. This is one of them actually competing. Notice only one runner, and it was one of the Americans who was doing the three-pointed crouch. It would resemble ours today, except he's not way down. The second from the left, the first one on the left is standing. The next one is doing that crouch. The other one's sort of in a semi-crouch, but that didn't come on till later. The aftermath of the games. Well, what can we say about them? They were successful. Pierre de Coubertin was happy. He felt the Greeks had really done a good job in administering the games along with his Olympic committee. But in bringing together a whole international group of athletes, first time that had been done with that many different countries involved. They were well run with minimal controversy, and that would not happen in the next few games for a while. It was left to further decisions by the IOC to create national Olympic committees to select their teams, but this would take time to evolve. It was still for the next game or two. It was games or two. It was kind of a, if you make it there, you can pay your way. Well, that was good. The boys, the athletes all really acquitted themselves very well in terms of effort and sportsmanship and enthusiasm and so on. And somewhere I saw a quote of the Greek, the king of Greece, I believe it was, that talked about the good sportsmanship and the good humor of all the American boys, and how refreshing that was, and just the whole good sportsmanship thing that went on, but particularly highlighted by the Americans. And it paved the way for the continuation of the games every 4 years. A rocky evolution to stability. So I'm just going to mention something about each one. 1900 in Paris. It was held along with this was because de Coubertin really wanted his home country to host, his home city to host the second games. He would have liked it for the first ones, but they had talked him into Athens. But they had a World's Fair going on, as they seem to do every 8 years or so in Paris particularly. But 1900 World's Fair. And finally, the World's Fair organizers, which were part of the government, kind of took over the games, and de Coubertin finally just gave up. And the games ran from May, sometime in about the middle of May, till November. There were people competing in contests that they didn't know they were competing in an Olympic contest. They thought it was, because there were a lot of just local and other contests going on. It was just totally disorganized. I mean, Coubertin was just beyond angry and upset about this happening. Okay, so what did they do then? They gave it to the Americans. It was supposed to go to Chicago. But St. Louis was holding a World's Fair. And someone thought it was a good idea after the Paris debacle to move it then. More World's Fair problems, and then travel complaints with Europeans. They thought they would be coming to one of the East Coast cities. They could just sail across the ocean and be in New York or Boston or Baltimore, one of the Philadelphia, somewhere along the coast. They realized before they even left that they were going to have to then travel into the wilderness. I mean, the frontier, Missouri. Oh my God, it's out by the Mississippi River. Would be safe going that far. And so many countries did not participate. And it turned out to be that the Americans just dominated practically everything because there were so few other competitors. And we had a very large contingent at that time. So de Coubertin's not very happy once again. So in 1906, they held I forgot the exact name of it, games in Athens again, just to try and get things back on track. They're not a part of the official Olympic record, but they were held there. And the 1908 games were given to London. Well, now, they were still, at this point, the host country provided all of the officials judging the track and field events. They didn't have all the electronics that we do today. Judging all of those events and so on. And there were political issues with the American contingent. We had a lot of Irish Americans from Boston out there in that team. And of course, England still ruled Ireland, and there were all the independence movements going on. And so there were constant things. The Americans, one of the Americans was a flag bearer, was one of the either one of the discus throwers or one of the weight men carrying the flag, and he refused to dip it when they had the parade going past the palace and the royal family sitting out there, and all the other countries dipped their flag, and he said the American flag bows to no royal. And so that created controversy right there. But there were just constant little minor skirmishes between some of the Irish Americans and British athletes as well. So that it was better organized, except for that. Then in 1912, de Coubertin's vision was realized. The Swedes knew what to do. My forebears. They were very highly organized. I mean, he invented the bauble, dynamite, and all that sort of thing. But at any rate, Stockholm ran a really, really good Summer Olympics, and they were there were no political problems, and also by that time they had ruled after London that the events, all of the events would be judged by international officials. You would not have a Swede judging any contest that Swedish athletes were in. So that kind of helped. 1916, of course, they were canceled for World War I. In 1920, Antwerp, Belgium, one of the war-torn countries, volunteered to host the Olympic Games, and they did. Europe was in a mess. France was torn up, and Belgium had both seen a lot of damage in World War I. But the Belgians stepped up and handled it, and they went well. And then in 1924, they would go back to Paris, which is where the movie Chariots of Fire is about the 1924 Olympics. And today we celebrate 128 years of Olympic Games in Paris. The end. Questions or comments? I really appreciated somebody mentioning things during the
Winter Olympics start.
Pardon me?
The Winter
The Winter Olympics are every other year, so they will be in, I forgot where they're going to be, but they'll be in 2026, 2 years from now. Usually in January, February, right in there. And I think we just heard that Salt Lake City has just been approved for 2034. The 28 games, summer games, will be in Los Angeles.
When did the Winter Olympics start?
1924 in Chamonix, France, in the mountains, beautiful city. And they were first held in 1924, and until I believe 1992 were always held the same year as the summer games. Then they decided to spread it out a little bit instead of having people getting maybe overviewing the Olympics in 1 year with both the winter in January and the summer in July or August or whatever. So the decision was made. So since then, it's been around since I think 92 or 94 that they have been every other year. So.
What about, just because I heard a podcast this morning, I can't remember the date, but women were allowed to compete.
The women what?
Were allowed to compete.
Yeah. It's kind of a little bit crazy because in 1900 women were competing they had golf and tennis, and women were competing in those events. I'm not sure about St. Louis but I think there were some there as well, and England. But then there were no. I think they began having women's track and field events, which were always originally the major games in the summer. 1928, they at least expanded it beyond the 200 meters, and they ran up to the 800 meters. But a bunch of the women, or not a bunch, but 2 or 3 of the women 800-meter runners at the end fell across the finish line, exhausted. And there was a great hue and cry that this is too hard on women. We can't do this. And so women's track and field continued after that. This Daisy Zaharias, the great outstanding women's athlete of the first half century, became the great golfer. And her big Olympics in 1932 in Los Angeles. So there were women competing from somewhere in the 1920s on a regular basis. But it wasn't until 1970, it wasn't until I think 84 that women were allowed to run in events longer than 400, longer than 200 meters. And invited the marathon. There had been the big battles over women in the Boston Marathon for a number of years, beginning in the late 60s. And that eventually got solved, and so it became more commonplace. And now what would we do in the Olympic Games if there were all these wonderful women's events? More than gymnastics. Anyone else?